Good morning, everybody. It's nice to see all of you. I see some familiar faces on my Brady Bunch screen, and I see some new faces, so it's terrific. And then, of course, there are like 4 or 5 more screens of faces I can't see because there are more of you than fit on the screen, which I think is just awesome that we are such a big gathering for this weekly review of This Week in Daf Yomi. We are about getting near a third into, well, maybe a quarter of the way into Masachet Nidarim. And what I thought I would do is try to both focus on some particular text, but try to zoom out and ask a bigger question of what is this Masachet about? What are the rabbis trying to communicate to us here? What's their message, and what do we make of what we've been studying? And hopefully I will have something that contributes to answering those questions to share with you as we look this morning. I picked a few texts. The first is like comes from the genre of wisdom literature. It's the rabbis giving us some good advice about what they think and want us to maybe think. And then I picked a few stories because I think it's often in the wisdom literature is sort of straightforward in saying, here, we're going to put this out for you. But I think it's often in the stories where the rabbis get to the heart of the matter, even more than in the legal literature. And we've had plenty of time to investigate the legal sections, although the stories relate to some of the legal pieces. So we'll see how that goes, and you'll weigh in on the chat about what you think about today's text. So I'm going to do this. I'm first going to paste. Rachel might have done this, but I'm going to paste a link into the chat. If you want to, I'm going to share on the screen the text. I know some people like to look at them later or pull it up in a separate window. You're welcome to do it however you want. And then I'm going to share my screen, and we will be off and running. Here we go. And I'm going to start the slideshow. Here we go. So this is the wisdom literature. It comes from a Breita, a text from the time of the Mishnah that didn't make it into the Mishnah itself. And the rabbis tell us a number of things in this Breita. One of them has to do with our topic of vows. So it's taught in the Breita, never become accustomed to taking vows because ultimately you will abuse oaths. Vows and oaths, we know, technically are different things, but they fall into similar categories of promises that have high stakes. The rabbis say, don't get accustomed to taking vows because you'll ultimately, or oaths also, because ultimately you'll abuse them or you'll fail to keep them, and there'll be some consequences for that. And this Breita is accompanied with 3 other pieces of advice. Do not regularly be around an ignoramus. Ama aretz is the Hebrew term, which sometimes it implies like ignorance. Sometimes it just implies like one of the common people. And sometimes it just implies someone who's not careful about or meticulous about Jewish living. And why should you not be around an Am Haaretz? Because ultimately, the Am Haaretz will feed you untithed produce. Parallel to that, they say do not regularly be around a priest who is an Am Haaretz, an ignoramus, because ultimately he will feed you truma. So while the first statement, the rabbis were saying, be careful with the promises you make because you don't want your words to be you don't want to take your own words lightly or come to fail to meet the commitments that you make. Here they're in a different area, but a place where they want to caution you about who you spend time with, but I think not about necessarily the people, but about the results of being with people who aren't careful. Because their concern is that you might eat untithed produce, which has to do with misappropriating property, or perhaps not being careful about taxes, which are the tithes, or eating what you shouldn't be eating. Similarly, with the case of the priest, right? There's a notion of truma, of course, is the food that priests can eat, but non-priests can't. That truma has a certain sense of holiness, and eating it if you're not supposed to is a violation. So these are 2 areas where the food you're eating, if not properly taken care of, could also lead you to go astray. Parallel to vows, the same way you can be not be careful with words and get yourself into trouble. You can be not careful with food and eating and taxes and tithes and status and also get into trouble. And the last line of this Braita says, don't talk extensively with women because ultimately you'll come to adultery. And here the rabbi's concern is sexual impropriety. And they say spending too much time with women will tempt you perhaps to misbehave. It struck me as I picked this text, right? I do want to call out that, this last line makes it clear that the rabbis are addressing men in this text and not everybody. My first thought was, well, this is one of those potentially problematic texts in a modern era in an egalitarian setting that points the finger at, women as being a danger. At the same time, as I look at the text as a whole in the context of the rabbis, right, what they're saying here is, right, we have some things we're concerned about. We want you to, right, sexual ethics are important. Being true to your word is important. Making sure you sort out what you eat and the food that's properly tithes or permitted to you. Those are all things that if you're not careful about, you can be led astray. And while these aren't the categories necessarily we think about today, I think this Braita is a place where the rabbis are giving us this advice. Be careful, because if you're not careful in a whole series of areas that are important to us, you can be led astray. And so the vows and the seriousness with which they take vows, which we've been reading about for the last 3-4 weeks, and we'll continue to do for a couple more months, falls into the list like this one, where the rabbis are saying there are things in life we have to be careful about, because when we're not, it could cause trouble for us down the road. Now to the stories, where sometimes they reinforce these points and sometimes they don't. That's what we're going to look at the mix of today. The first story I want to take a look at is in the realm of vows. Says the following: Rav Kahana happened to come to the home of Rav Yosef. So a rabbi visits another rabbi. We see lots of stories like this. He said to him, let the master eat something. So Rav Kahana is the teacher coming to the home of Rav Yosef, and Rav Yosef says, eat something. Let the master eat something. He uses language of respect, and Rav Kahana says back, no, by the master of all, I will not eat it. So the student offers his visiting teacher something to eat, and the teacher says, makes a vow, invoking God's name and saying, I will not eat. And the student says, he said to him, no, by the master of all, you will not eat it. Repeats his lines back to him. Now the Gemara says a little bit about the story. The Gemara says Rav Kahana's statement, no, by the master of all, is well understood. The first statement we get, says the Gemara. He says, in God's name, I'm not going to eat. He makes a vow saying he's not going to eat. That's clear. But, asks the Gemara, for Rav Yosef, why did he say afterwards, no, by the master of all, you will not eat it? What's the repetition that the student makes back to the teacher? And the Gemara says, well, this is what he said to him, meaning this is what he meant to him. No, by the master of all is what you said, right? You invoked in your language that, right, you invoke God's name in this, and therefore you may not eat the food that I'm offering you. So what's this text saying? The teacher comes into the student's house. The student offers him food. The teacher says, no, I don't want food. But instead of saying, no, thank you, he makes a vow and invokes God's name. And the student says, well, because you said it that way, you can't eat, right? I take back my offer of hospitality. I take back my offer of food. Here's a story that reinforces some of the themes we've seen in Masechet Nidarim thus far, right? That Nidarim are important. Oaths are important. You have to be careful with what you say. And when you say something, you're held by it. And here the student, maybe a little sharply, holds his master to this vow that he took and said, I'm not going to feed you because you made an oath invoking God's name saying you're not going to eat food. perhaps reinforcing the text that we saw before. Be careful with your oaths because you'll be stuck with them. Rav Kahana makes this vow. He's stuck now not eating in the home of his student. I don't know how long his visit was or how long this oath was in play, but if it was, if he came for Shabbat, maybe he's out of luck for eating for the whole Shabbat. I don't know. We don't know the rest of the story or any more context, but here's a story reinforcing vows and the importance of them. But we have some other stories that maybe have a little bit of a different message. The next one's not about vows, but
Rabbi Goldberg, Robert Starr says, why not read it the other way around?
Ooh, hang on. Let me go back. Thank you for interrupting with that. Why not read it the other way around? So Robert, can we, Robert, can we let Robert explain what the other way around would be?
Yeah, Robert, we're going to put you on the spot. I'm asking you to unmute.
Yeah, so how do you know who's saying, in the dialogue part, how do you know who's the student and who is the teacher? Because it's both he said to him.
Yes. Ooh, I love that question, Robert. Thank you. So that's an astute observation. And actually, I use the Steinsaltz translation as the translation that I work with when I'm teaching or writing for My Jewish Learning. And if you're familiar with that or other translations as well, many fill in the blanks. He said to him could be one way, could be the other way. And so, Robert, that's a great literary question. How do we know which person is which? So first, separate from this story in particular, I must say, it's one of the things I like about the stories themselves, and especially you'll see it in the stories we're looking at today in the Talmud. Not only are they missing lots of details, sometimes they're missing lots of details that are really important. Right? It just says Rav Kahana happened to the home of Rav Yosef, and then it says he said to him and he said to him. How do we know it's supposed to be read one way? How do we know it's supposed to be read the other? It can't be read the other way too. And sometimes, Robert, as you're saying, right, a story in the Talmud like this can be read multiple ways, and it's possible to see, right, the different meanings. It happens later on in the story. The Gemara actually specifies when it says Rav Kahana's statement is well understood, but Rav Yosef's is not. It seems to label it, which if you line it up, that brings us back to reading in a particular way. Some of this is also just literary pattern and form, and just sort of knowing the relationships, right? Rav Kahana coming to Rav Yosef's house, and then one says to the other, let the master eat something. It's going to be, in a rabbinic story like this, the person whose house they're at that offers food to the other person. That's what led me and others to say that first line he said to him is Rav Yosef to Rav Kahana. That it goes in that direction. Sometimes you can flip the story and it gives it a different meaning. If you flipped it and it was the teacher saying it to the student, it still makes the same point I think about vows, but it might be a little it's one thing if a student is rebuking their teacher. It's another thing if the teacher is rebuking their student. We have stories in the Gemara in both directions. Sometimes it's sharp when the student rebukes their teacher because it breaks the normal hierarchy. Sometimes it's sharp when the teacher rebukes the student because they puts him in his place a little bit. There's a little place putting here, whichever direction it goes. But Robert, I'm glad you raised that issue because it's something you have to ask when you read a Talmudic story that doesn't fill in all these details. So I hope that that answers some.
Yeah. I'll just add, I can't see myself, so I hope I've got this right. But there are these nice compilations out there of, this is one I particularly like called Who's Who in the Talmud. Where you can look up these rabbis if you're not familiar with them. If you don't know all of Talmudic literature and you're not familiar with them, and you can see and you can learn a lot about their relationship to each other and their generation. So I just peeked at it now, and if I've got it right, because I'm doing it while Rabbi Goldberg's talking, but there are two Rav Kahanas. They're a first generation of actually there's a Rav Kahana in every generation. Okay, so that's
there's a lot of Rav Kahanas. That makes
a
it
lot of Rav Kahanas. So that this is a very poor example of what I'm trying to show. And then I look up Rav Kahana and Rav Yosef, and sometimes I can see what generation they're in, where they live, and get a sense. And then also this book will explain who's student and what the relationship is like. So these things are put together by people who know the literature really well and have looked up every citation of each person. And those kind of things can be helpful in figuring out the relationship. Today, it's a total fail because there is a first generation Rav Kahana and a second generation Rav Kahana and a third generation Rav Kahana and a fourth generation Rav Kahana and a fifth generation Rav Kahana, and then a whole lot of other Rav Kahanas too. So it was a very popular name.
Yes, Rav Yosef probably also. There's a few. I would say, just on that note, if you don't, you could buy this volume or others. Safaria has embedded into their text. If you hover over the name of a rabbi, it'll give you. They put in briefer than that volume that you showed, Rachel, but on Safari Online you can find some of that information as well. Sometimes it's helpful, sometimes it's not helpful, because of, like, there are many Rav Kahanas, and the academic literature will tell you, based on manuscripts and things, sometimes the names that appear in the Talmud, we can't be 100% sure. First, connecting the names to biography, or also some stories in different manuscripts have different names of rabbis. So depending on what manuscript you're looking at, like, the names might change in a particular story, but still the relationships can add to the layers as well.
Yeah.
All right. Story number 2. This also is brief. The characters are clear most of the time, but it does require some explanation. Not necessarily about vows, but it is something about language, which I'll come back to after we look at the story. So this story says 2 residents of Chozai joined Ula on his ascent to Eretz Yisrael. Ula is a rabbinic character who we've met before, who is one of the rabbis who travels back and forth from Israel to Babylonia, often delivering Talmudic information, decisions, conversations back and forth. It happened as he was traveling, right? He didn't walk alone. He was with others, and 2 residents of Ozai were with him. One arose and slaughtered the other. Maybe there's a murder mystery here. Something happened. One of these residents of Ozai killed the other one. Wait a minute. There's a whole line missing from the story on my slide. Oh, no, sorry, there isn't. I'm reading it wrong. It's because it's brief. One rose and slaughtered the other. He said to Ula, I got confused because that's back to Robert, doesn't it? He said to Ula, did I act properly? So it doesn't fill in who the he is. We'll come back to that in a second. But he said to him, yes, and open the place of the slaughter. Lots of mystery here about what this could mean. But he said to Ula, the commentator suggests that this means the surviving resident of Chozai said to Ula, did I act properly? Did I do this right in killing my landsman, my peer, our fellow traveler? And Ula says back, yes, you did. You acted properly by killing this other person and opened the place of the slaughter. The commentator suggested this means, like, take the wound that you created when you attacked this other person and tear it open further, meaning, you injured the person, but, rip open the wound so the person's end comes faster. Sorry, a little gruesome. We're in the PG-13, bordering on the R in terms of violence in the Talmud. A little bit of a scary story, not so many details here, but one person on the trip kills another. They ask Ula if they did the right thing, and Ula says yes. So when he came before Rabbi Yochanan, he said to him, perhaps, heaven forbid, I've strengthened the hand of sinners. Here too, see the text, it just says where he came before him, right? Could be the murder, the person who killed the other person, but most people read this to say that it's Ula. Ula comes before Rabbi Yochanan when he gets to Eretz Yisrael, where Rabbi Yochanan is, it says, oh my God, maybe I strengthened the hand of sinners because I told this person that what they did was okay. Right, a person on my trip killed another person on my trip, asked me if they acted properly, and I said yes. Ula's having some regrets about the language that we used. And Rabbi Yochanan says back to him, he says to him, you saved yourself. Also maybe a little cryptic, but what do the commentators say that this means? Right? Ula's questioning whether he responded to this question appropriately. And Rabbi Yochanan said, well, it seems that you're in a dangerous situation with someone who's capable of murder acting if he acted okay. And by you saying, yes, you acted okay, and maybe encouraging him to finish the task, what you did was keep yourself safe. It's a little bit of a cryptic story that we find this week. But I think in terms of the seriousness of language, what the connection here to the vows, I think it comes, for me anyways, in the self-reflection that Ula is doing about his statement. He's in this really tense situation. He gets asked an uncomfortable question and answers it in the way that he does. And later he has regret that he chose the words that he chose. Why? Because maybe he should have rebuked the person. Maybe he should have spoke out, and criticized the person for being violent to the other. Now, we don't know what caused the one person to kill the other because there aren't any details about whatever the conflict was, if it was a long-standing blood rivalry between their two families or some conflict that got out of control on the trip. But Ula has some trepidation that maybe he chose his words poorly and acted wrongly. And Rabbi Yochanan says to him, in that situation, what did you do? You saved yourself. Maybe, maybe the person didn't act properly, but in that moment, in that context, what you said was appropriate. Because it appeased the other person and kept you out of danger. So here's a place I'm struck by this story in this Masachet in particular because it's saying, well, words matter, but here there are some extenuating circumstances by which Rabbi Yochanan is saying to Ula, you have reason to speak maybe not truthfully or maybe not ethically, there are other motivations for your words, and those are legitimate that allow you to say something that maybe ultimately isn't truthful or isn't ethical, and you have grounds to change. And I bring that because we also see examples of that have to do with vows. Well, see the clock. I'm running out of minutes. So let me just do this story really quick, and then we'll try to wrap this up. Maybe parallel in a certain way about, right? Sometimes we have to, well, let's read the story, then I'll sum it up. Rabbi Shimon, the son of Rabbi Yehuda and Nasi, had a vow to dissolve. So Rabbi Shimon made a vow. He wants to dissolve it. And he came before the sages. And they said to him, did you vow with the knowledge of this? Right? They asked him a question about his vow. When you took the vow, did you have knowledge about this particular element of it? He says, yes. And they ask him, did you vow with the knowledge of this? Another question. And he says, yes. Right? What are the rabbis doing? As we saw this week, the rabbis are investigating the details of the vow because, as we learned this week, there are certain kind of vows and certain kind of circumstances where you're not held necessarily to the vow. And they're trying to investigate if he had certain foreknowledge when he made the vow or not that could get him out of the vow. So this happened several times. The sages asked Rabbi Shimon several times questions about his vow, and the sages were troubled in the fact that he kept saying yes. The text says they were troubled from sun to shade and from shade to sun. Not clear exactly what that phrase means because it's a little awkward. And not totally clear. Some commentators say they were like agitated that he kept saying yes and they couldn't get him out of the vow, so they started like pacing around the room. Some commentators say like the sun moved throughout the sky, so right, places that were sunny became shady and vice versa, like that they were at this for a long time. But there was a long time of Rabbi Shimon being asked questions about his vow, and his answers were yes, so they couldn't get him out of it. So what happened? Bonit, the son of Abba Shaul ben Bonit, said to him, would you have vowed with the knowledge that the sages would be troubled from shade to sun and sun to shade? So someone comes and asks him, if you had known the sages would spend all afternoon asking you questions and getting upset about the fact that, your answer kept being yes, would you, if you had known that you would cause this trouble in the Beit Midrash about your vow, would you have still made it? And he said, no. So finally, there's a circumstance where he says, no, not about the vow in particular, but about the process of dissolving the vow. And what happens? Based on this, the rabbis dissolve the vow. This story I find, in a whole series like them, there's a whole run of stories like this. I found this to be striking, like the one before it, even though the contexts are different, because each of these stories say, in some ways, undermine some of the points of Masechet Nidarim. Right? Nidarim says, let's be really careful with our language because we have to stick to it. Right? The master says, the teacher says, right, by God, I'm not going to eat. And his student says, all right, I'm not going to feed you while you're a guest in my house. He's stuck in that vow. But we also see stories like this one today, a whole run of stories where people made vows and we go to great efforts to find ways to get them out of them. So it's a contradictory message. We have to take our words seriously, but we also sometimes try to get people out of them. Same thing with that story about Ula, right? He's regretting the words that he said in this tough moment that he was in. And his teacher, Rabbi Yochanan, is saying, well, there are contexts and circumstances where we say things that we wouldn't say ideally, but the context drives us to save them, and we should be okay with that because of extenuating circumstances. That's true with vows as well. And as some people are starting to say in the commentary here, right? We saw it this week a lot. Some ways, we saw lots of pages leading up to this week saying vows are important. We have to take them seriously. And this week we say there are lots of kinds of vows that we could just nullify either on our own or we have to go to court to do that. But the rabbis seem to be undermining the point that they're making about vows. Or, they're making contradictory points, which I would say, and you might say, the Talmud often makes contradictory points. That's part of what I love about it. But we see in this week's reading, these different texts pulling in different directions. We ought to, as the rabbis advise, take our words seriously because we don't want to be stuck with vows and oaths that we can't keep. Or the consequences with them. Yet there are circumstances when we can't hold ourselves to the highest of standards. And there are times at which what we're motivated by, or the rabbis are motivated by, is to try to get people out of their vows. And sometimes this might be in the Talmudic terminology, there's like lechatchila and b'diavad. There's the cases of like what's ideal and then what we do after the fact.